there is an insensitivity of youth towards the plight of the elderly. And this became really clear to me when I was in my 40s. I had a communications company and quite a few people working full-time for me along the Danforth. And I was in a hurry, as I was in a hurry a lot those days. And I was hurrying by the IGA just past Pape on the Danforth. And there was this woman, older woman, maybe 50s, and I just noticed she was crying in front of the IGA. And it was right at that cusp where I just had to get in to work. Or did I stop? And I just stopped and asked her, if there was anything I could help with, or what was the problem. And she said that she had been diagnosed as a diabetic, and her was only able to work part-time, and she needed special medication and special food, and it hadn't been processed through the system, the additional funds for the food. And so she said she was just stuck with needing to beg for the first time in her life. And she'd been begging in front of the IGA, and a group of teenagers had come by, and she said, they'd been very cruel to her. And but right away she said, I understand why. And so, I asked her, well, why would they be cruel? And she said, they're cruel because they don't want to become like me. And I think somehow that is part of the insensitivity of youth to the aged or aging process, is that they want to stay young. They believe they'll stay young, and they push it away. They push what they don't want to become away. And so that can lead to the insensitivity. But I guess the question is, when were we awakened to the plight of the elderly? As caregivers, when earlier in our lives, when was that moment where we felt an empathetic connection with somebody who wasn't in our age group, and felt a sympathy and a connection? And for me, it happened at quite an unusual time and place. I was at a party. I had friends who'd organized a beach party at their house, and they had it was in a cooperative housing down in Toronto, downtown, and there was at the back a raised courtyard, that linked all of the apartments together. And we weren't supposed to really, I'm sure they weren't supposed to really have a big party in that cooperative housing. But anyway, they were having a big party. And the reason why it was big was one of the women that was hosting the party, there wasn't enough people initially coming from their circle, and they wanted a whole lot of new people at the party to make it full. So it was wintertime, and with a big jacket on over top of her bathing suit, she went to a local bar just before closing, or 11 or 12 o'clock or something like that. And then shouted out, there's a party at, our place down the road. And then she opened her jacket up, and there was her bathing suit. And so it seems like everyone cleared out of the bar, and we had a kind of small beach party, but all of a sudden at 11 o'clock, the whole place was packed with a lot of people from the bar. And it was hard to breathe. It was just so full and packed with people. And that I went outside into that common courtyard just to get some fresh air. And I walked out, and I could see in the darkness there was like some benches around. And I walked towards one of the benches. And as I did, I heard what seemed to be sobbing in the darkness. I couldn't quite place where it was coming from. And then I saw a figure sitting on one of the benches. And I realized that's where the sobbing was coming from. And so I went up to that person and asked if I could sit on the bench. And so I sat beside this older woman, and I asked her why she was crying. And she said that it was her birthday today, and that her son was planning on visiting her, and it was now 11 o'clock and he hadn't arrived. And so, having a nature of wanting to fix things or something, I said, I've just come from a party, and I said, would you like to go to a party? And she looked over and said, yes, I would. And so I said, well, let's go to the party. And my mom had trained me that when we walked together, I was to put out my arm, and then my mom would put her arm through mine. And then I had to walk on the outside of the street, so if anything splashed up, she had these, these rules, so I'd learnt them from my mom. And I put my arm out, and she took my arm. She was probably in her 70s, although when you're in your 20s like that, it's all kind of amorphous, past 50 maybe, or 60. And we walked towards the party. And as we did, of course, the music, the beat, got louder and louder. And then I started to have second thoughts about the party. And as we moved towards the sliding glass door, you could see the party inside. It was quite wild, and I was starting to hesitate, but I remember feeling the woman walk confidently. She wasn't hesitating, and so we walked in, and as we stepped over that little sliding glass threshold, into the wave of the party, it became clear. It had become even wilder since I'd left. There was because a lot of people at the bar were from a motorcycle gang. And so there were motorcycle jackets and lots of tattoos. And there was a game of strip poker being played. And it was sort of halfway along the game of strip poker. And so it really wasn't the kind of party you would bring a 70-year-old. But she didn't hesitate over that threshold. She stepped right in. And then, we went into the kitchen and pushed our way in, but people moved a little bit, so we could get through. And then somebody asked her when we got to the kitchen what she would like to drink. And she wanted a glass of, I think we had some champagne. And so she had a glass of champagne. And then when we came back, it just so happened that there was a space on the couch where there hadn't been. And so we sat down, with our drinks. And then somebody asked her if she wanted to dance. And so she said yes, and they danced. And I noticed the strip poker game being played in reverse. People, the clothes started to go back on. And somebody asked her, well, what music did she like? And nothing dramatically changed in the party. The party just kept on going. But it's as though the party had a new center. And it had a meaning and a purpose, and it was elevated in some way. And somehow, everyone there just got it. That this woman needed something. And they made her feel like she belonged. As you can see, I've never forgot that moment and that experience. And I guess the question is, when was your compassion awakened for the plight of the elderly, where you could really empathize with their experience and then feel how good it is to be able to make a difference in the midst of someone else's difficulty? It reminds me of the story of Siddhartha, the early story of Prince Siddhartha, that his mother died when he was very young, according to the story, when he was a young boy, and his father was a king. He was a prince, so his father was a king. And his father was told by a soothsayer, a medicine person, somebody who could read the future, that his son would either become a king or a great warrior or a spiritual leader. And the king said, well, he said, I clearly want him to be either a king or a great warrior. I don't want him to be a spiritual leader. How do I prevent that from happening? And so the medicine person said that you eliminate all evidence of old age and death. If you eliminate that until he grows up, he'll be a great king or a great warrior. And so the king was incredibly detailed in that task. And in fact, everyone in the royal palace and everyone around the prince knew that they were to eliminate any evidence of aging or death. And so even the gardener at the royal palace, there wasn't allowed to be an old fallen leaf on the garden. So there was no evidence of aging or death. Everyone who served the prince was young, and when they rode in their carriage through town, that there were people that went out in advance and made sure that every evidence of aging, every older person was taken off the street. Everybody who was infirm was taken off the street. And so when the carriage would ride through, he would just see youth and people that were young and or younger and not aged. But one day some older person slipped through or came out of a doorway just as the carriage went by and fell down in front of the carriage. And Siddhartha got out, and all at once he saw somebody who was aging and dying. And then it's reported that that's how he became a great spiritual teacher rather than the king or a great leader. And so that was the moment his empathy began, and of course started a great journey that led to awakening and the Buddha. So, what awakened your empathy for the aging process?